Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Pure Encouragement Podcast. I am so excited today to welcome my good friend, Dr. Ben Shaw. My man is joining us. He is the president of Core Apologetics, and he's been working with Dr. Gary Habermas for many years, who is regarded as one of the world's leading experts on Jesus' resurrection. And so today we are going to dive into all sorts of awesome stuff about the resurrection of Jesus. Dr. Shaw was an editor with a book with Dr. Habermas, which he was just showing me a second ago, super thick, over 1,000 pages. It's contained over 7,000 footnotes. How about that, man? What a project. Amazing. You've also authored a handful of different articles and books. You've co-authored 24 publications and given presentations at conferences and at universities. You've taught at Liberty University, at Colorado Christian. And one of my favorites, you are a black belt in jiu-jitsu with, dude, that is like much respect. Just saying, you can take people down with the Bible and some of the apologetical worlds. And then at the same time, you got some physical skill, my man. So, and also you got some hockey in your past. So you and I, we're buds going back on the hockey front, but we're so excited to have you. Thanks for being on today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm certainly excited to be here. Man, yeah, hockey and jiu-jitsu is great. And then when we get to talk about Jesus too, it's even better. So it's a great combination of things you can put together.
God's awesome, man. That's so good. So I'm excited to dive in today. We are going to talk all about the resurrection of Jesus. And what does that even have to do, for our lane of living a strong, victorious life in Christ? That's what we get the privilege to do at Pure Encouragement. And what does that have to do with the resurrection of Jesus? For me, as I think about it, Ben, I just think about how the resurrection radically changed people's lives.
Yeah.
We saw disciples that were in the upper room and they were terrified and afraid. They had seen Jesus be crucified. They were now the targets likely of the people that took Jesus down. They were going to then take them down. And so they were full of fear. They're hiding in an upper room. And then the resurrection happens. They encounter the resurrected Jesus. And we see a radical shift to where these men go to the ends of the earth to give their lives to declare that Jesus rose from the dead. And that's ultimately where Christianity started to expand. It's amazing. So what I want to dive into today, just about the resurrection of Jesus, I think it's completely tied to living a confident, victorious life. Now, I would love for you to speak to that. I got a handful of questions for you. So please give us your thoughts and let's get this thing going.
Yeah. I'll try to hit a couple elements there on that first question. And a lot comes in 1 Corinthians 15. That is the resurrection chapter. Paul is writing all about the resurrection. It's the pinnacle of the letter to the church in Corinth. And he starts the very first verse that he's reminding the church in Corinth that he gave them the gospel. And in verse 1, 2, and 3, he gives them the gospel that has the power to save, and it's of first importance. And then he goes on to tell you what that is, that Jesus died, was buried, was seen, and resurrected. So the resurrection is of first importance for believers. It's of first importance for the gospel. But then, as you were saying, what does it mean for believers who want to live a victorious life? And when you look just a couple verses later, in verses 13 to 19, Paul goes on to describe, well, if the resurrection didn't happen, some things follow. Our faith is in vain. Our hope's in vain. We're still in our sins. We're of all men most to be pitied. But he also says we're made to be liars because we're giving false testimony about God by saying he raised Jesus from the dead, but he really did do that. So you mentioned a moment ago that they were willing to suffer and die for Jesus' resurrection. That's true. But they were also risking their eternal salvation and souls by lying about God if they were lying. So they're not just risking their lives, but also their soul. So a very profound point there. Of course, Paul's saying that's if the resurrection is not true. Of course, it is true. So he's willing to suffer physically, and he's willing to tell other people because he wants them to be saved as well. But then at the very end of 1 Corinthians 15, this was very important for me because I'm from Florida, from Fort Lauderdale. I saw a lot of people pursuing all the worldly things, and I wrestled with that. I like the book Ecclesiastes because I was like, oh, that's kind of vanity what you're doing there, and that's vanity. Okay, well, what's kind of the point? Why should I be motivated to go and do some things? And I was motivated to play hockey because I wanted a wife, so that was part of it. I think a lot of us can relate to that. It did work out. I did meet my wife through hockey. But God really was the one using hockey to get me to go to Liberty because I had a lot of questions and I didn't realize that. So while I was at Liberty, I started asking these questions about God. And Habermas was the first hockey coach at Liberty. And I met him as the hockey coach. And then later I realized he's the leading resurrection expert. But long story short, the point I'm bringing all that up for, or reason I'm bringing that up, is because at the very end of 1 Corinthians 15, Paul gives all this evidence for the resurrection. It's true. He's responding to those who are doubting it and have questions. He's explaining that we're the first, that Jesus is the first fruits, a promise for us. He talks about how death has lost its sting because Jesus has conquered death. That's talk about victory. I mean, Paul can taunt death. I don't know of a more victorious people on the planet. But then in verse 58, so at the very end, all that, and he wraps up to say, therefore, just relax. I'm going to come set the world straight. Don't worry about anything. Like, no, that's not what he says. He says, be steadfast in your good works, for they're not in vain in the Lord. So that should encourage us to that victorious activity right now in the present. We don't have to fear death because it's been defeated. And right now we should be doing those good things. We can be motivated that the things we do, they're not vain. They're actually filled with eternal meaning and significance. So it's very profound, especially for me growing up as someone who wrestled with those other things. I was like, oh my goodness. But now, not only am I moved, but I'm convicted to do those good things. And I ask myself, be steadfast. That assumes I was already doing it. So have I already been doing it? And if so, what have I been doing? So I've got to do some self-reflection to see, oh, have I been doing the good works that I've been created in Christ Jesus to walk in?
What a
So those
great
are some
point
of
you
those
make
areas.
about this verse in 1 Corinthians 15. I have it right in front of me where it says, death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. But thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. What an unbelievable passage. And you make a good point. It's like the resurrection of Jesus ultimately leads to this victorious life because there is no more death that we have to fear. There's no more
Yeah.
death in front of us that ends everything. Like we get to now have a chance to live with Jesus for eternity because Jesus conquered the grave. We have hope that we too are going to conquer the grave, which means that we don't have to be afraid today in all the different things that we face because we have an eternal hope. We have an eternal purpose. It draws us to something greater, and we get to have this conviction that even though this world is on fire with so much pain and suffering, I have a hope that I'm going
Right.
to spend eternity with Jesus with no sickness, no pain, no disease, no dying. Glory to God.
Yes,
Victory.
it's incredible. And what's really amazing too, and we it's easy for us to forget this, especially oftentimes in the West, because death and those sorts of things are often not in our face every day. We don't see them. But the early Christians were said to despise death. So not only are they not afraid of it, it's like a welcoming. It's a welcome party. Like, oh, good, I get to go be with Jesus. You think this is going to scare me? Like that's not a fear. That's an offer. And so,
Wow.
um, man, there's a
That's a
couple
good point
different
you make
elements
about
there.
the
Yeah.
cultural realities of that, like how they would have seen and thought of death in their day. That's an interesting thought to think. Another thing that I thought was a really good point you just made was where the Jews, like, for them to then lay their lives down on the resurrection of Jesus, like you mentioned, how that was a big step of faith for them. That this wasn't just them, making up a lie and then laying their life down to try to prove a lie. Like for them, a lot of these guys were really devoted
Right.
Jews.
Yeah.
They were not men that were casual about the scriptures. They were genuinely seeking. So for them to call Jesus the Son of God, for them to lay their lives down for a resurrection, story or resurrection narrative, like they had to have conviction.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a great saying. Mike Lacona has it. It's called "Liars make poor martyrs." Because why do people lie? They don't lie for suffering. They lie for some sort of an advantage, for money or power or something like that. But they don't lie to suffer. And when we think, like, a lot of us think suffering is like going a day without your phone or something. Like, this is suffering without medicine. Like, they don't have Tylenol for after you just got lashed 39 times. Like, that's suffering. Like, they are willing to do that because the gospel message, they're out there to be a witness, to testify to the gospel. and to be that light to the world. And then the world doesn't always accept it with sunshine and rainbows.
Well, this is one reason for me, it really strengthens my faith as I think about moments where maybe I doubt. And you spend a ton of time with core apologetics now, dealing with doubters and helping people work through these questions, which is just extraordinary. I love your ministry. I love what you do. For me, when I start to have questions maybe that hit me and I'm doubting something, I feel like I can come back to this question of the resurrection and I can literally ask, did the resurrection happen? And because I have conviction that yes, it did. And one of the reasons that I feel like it did is because I look at the lives of those men who literally gave their lives immediately. They went from fear in an upper room to boldness in telling people about the resurrected Jesus in front of the very people that led Jesus to be crucified.
Yeah.
Something happened. That is one reason that gives me just an increased conviction in the resurrection, and it helps me deal with doubt. It's not the only thing
Yeah.
that kind of strengthens my belief in the resurrection, but it's definitely a big thing. And so
Well,
give us some
man,
thoughts to that.
yeah, you're saying so much there. I hope I got a little ADD and a little OCD, so hopefully we can track on both of them. Yeah, what you said about the resurrection happening, I remember being on Liberty's campus after I had read The Case for the Resurrection. That's Habermas's, that's one of his earlier books, not one of those big 1,000-page ones, but a much shorter one. And I remember thinking to myself, well, no matter what I do moving forward, Jesus rose from the dead, and I've got to deal with that. Like, it doesn't change. It's an anchor for us. And regardless of our present circumstances, our present feelings, whatever the case may be, he still rose from the dead. And so that's just something that can either convict you because you're like, oh, he rose from the dead. I shouldn't be doing this. Or it can be comforting because you have some tragedy and you're like, you know, yeah, Dr. Habermas, for example, he lost his wife in the mid 90s and that's why he stopped being the hockey coach. But he's got a hope that he doesn't grieve as those without hope. So, you know, it can be comforting, it can be convicting, it can be encouraging. It has all these different elements to it. And the disciples' willingness to suffer and die, it is a widely accepted historical fact that they were willing to endure different types of punishments, pain, whatever the situation arose for the different disciples. And you mentioned that they were transformed, but you also have two other people that were incredibly transformed. Paul, persecutor of the church, like he thought these Christians were crazy and he had to put a stop to it. But you also have James, who was Jesus's brother, who was a skeptic during Jesus's own lifetime, who then became a believer. And so, he saw the risen Jesus and that now he's the leader of the Jerusalem church. So what explains those things? And by the way, the martyrdom of Peter, Paul, and James, those are some of the best evidenced martyrdoms we have in the first century reports for them. So yeah, really
Wow.
strong, convicting
Amazing.
evidence
Yeah.
there just
Just
for
the
that one element.
testimony of these guys. And the thought, some skeptics in our day might say, well, maybe those guys, they weren't just educated very much. But the reality is they were devout. Those men were committed. They were smart. They were not foolish. So for them to make the decisions that they did, they really wrestled to come to that conviction to go against the waves of culture and tradition. And then, like you said, to be martyred for this, no, people don't do that for a lie. So
Right.
we have to grapple with that. You made a really good point a second ago about I have to grapple with the reality of the resurrection. What am I going to do about that? And I think that's a really great question for all of us to consider. And it's also a source of living a victorious life. What are we going to do about the resurrection? It strengthens us and it also challenges us. It's a
It's
great
like
point.
it's like Amazing Grace, the line in Amazing Grace. It's terrifying, but it's so freeing at the same time.
So good. Yes. All right. So you've spent a ton of time in your life researching the ins and outs of the resurrection. You've dug into the archaeology, you've dug into the historical texts, you've looked at non biblical writers, you've looked at all sorts of different things about this. I want to throw a few questions your way. Is there any physical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus or only what we read in the Bible? What have you discovered?
Physical evidence. Um, I'll give two lines of potential. One is it's related to Jesus's resurrection, but it's not evidence for his specific resurrection. But it's a very important discovery. They found, I believe it was in the 1960s, a heel bone that had a nail driven through it, and the nail had hit a knot in the wood. So it was a crucifixion victim. And it created a hook so the nail couldn't come back out because they would reuse nails. So they just took the whole thing and put it, and they buried this guy who was a crucifixion victim. For a long time, you had a bunch of skeptical scholars who doubted Jesus was buried because he was crucified. But here we've got evidence of a crucifixion victim with the nail still in his ankle, and that he was buried in the same area in Jerusalem during the 30s AD, which is when Jesus is thought to have been killed. So that's one line of evidence that can get unpacked further, but the more provocative and more fun, probably, discussion is the Shroud of Turin could be considered physical evidence. Some of the guys who have studied it, they kind of joke and say um, it's like a picture of the resurrection.
Hmm.
So
I've done a fair share of reading on this and listening to different videos from Dr. Habermas in particular. I was largely a skeptic on it. I was just thinking, it's maybe a relic. It's not that reliable. And the more that I've listened to it, it's actually fascinating.
it's really hard to account for all the different facets of the shroud and to do that simultaneously. And it's got incredible, like, if we all spilled, we're a bunch of athletes. We've all spilled Gatorade on our shirt at some point, and it goes right through, right? So you can see it on both sides. It goes through all the threads. On the shroud, the linen, there's about 2 to 300 fibrils on each strand, right? The image is only on the first 3 to 5 fibrils. So it's not paint, it's not an ink, it's not a dye, it's not anything like that. How is that image just on those first fibrils? And there's a number of websites you can go to look at those. Like, we're not, like, it's readily available today, which is pretty
Yeah, I
neat.
think we can link, some videos from Dr. Habermas on the Shroud of Turin in the notes below for people that might be interested in checking that out. It's truly awesome. As I've listened in, I'm really amazed. And so, yeah, physical evidence, we see, things like the crucifixion victim and the heel bone. We see things like the Shroud of Turin. We have the different things like the disciples as well. I would say that's a very much an evidence of life transformation, that these guys would go and proclaim to the ends of the earth this message of Christianity. And there's more, I think, that we could throw in that maybe aren't from the first century, but we've also mentioned some near-death experiences. I know you've had some different encounter of reading on that topic. Would you bring us into that and how that might give us some insight into the resurrection of Jesus,
Yeah,
that there is a life after death?
I do.
That
Yeah, I'll do.
some
I
thoughts on
got to
that.
share a story about Dr. Habermas, though, and the Shroud of Turin before I go. We were getting ready to go to a really big conference, and he calls me the day before. He's like, "Hey, Ben, you still planning to go to this conference with me?" And I'm like, "Yeah." He goes, "If I don't go, are you still gonna go?" And I'm like, "Why would you ask that?" "Well, I've got COVID and I can't go to the conference. Can you speak on the Shroud of Turin for me?" I'm just like, "Oh my goodness." Those are big shoes to fill. So, I did, but that was an exciting one of my first times doing, like, a public lecture on that subject. Now on near-death experiences, yeah, that's something we actually have a chapter, we wrote together on near-death experiences, Habermas and I, and they are fascinating. They're very fascinating. They're very well evidenced. I would imagine most people listening to this have they either know someone who's had a near-death experience, or they may even have had one. There's millions of them. Now, for our research, we typically focus. We identify two types: subjective and evidential near-death experiences. So there's two different branches there. Subjectives are like, I saw a light, I did a light review, there was a barrier, things like that. The evidential cases, however, they can be corroborated. So, like, if I have a heart attack right now, and then I'm like, "Oh, man, Gary, you've got a really cool car. Like, it's whatever. It's a red car." And you're like, "Ben, you have no way you should know that." But I shouldn't know it because like, even consciously, but especially if I've had a heart attack and I've got a flat heart and flat EEG going, or flat EEG, flat EKG, but I'm able to report this evidence that you can corroborate. And so there's many cases like that. One of the strangest cases actually comes from Florida when the guy's getting surgery, I think in Minnesota, and he ends up dying, and he reports things that go on in his house. Some of them should be going on. But but that shows that there's evidence for afterlife.
Mm.
And there's many, many cases like that. There's many, many evidential cases. So it's a great stepping stone towards the resurrection. There's a number of cases where people meet Jesus There's a number of cases where people have a hellish or distressing experience. Those are more that subjective style because we can't corroborate it. But there's other ones that they reveal information that maybe we shouldn't know. So there's we call them Twilight Zone cases. So there's some really fascinating ones, but one of the biggest takeaways is, one, naturalism, materialism can't explain these, because if your brain's dead, you're not supposed to have any experiences, let alone having them and remembering them. So very strange there. So atheism, materialistic naturalism it's got some problems there. And then it opens this world um, of afterlife to us, which is really important, obviously, for resurrection. So that's one of the things we talk about. Um, and we were talking about how death had been defeated at the beginning. And what's interesting is in the ancient world, like for believers, death is abnormal. That's not part of the natural process. Like that came when sin came into the world. But for the outside Greco-Roman world, that was normal. They thought, oh yeah, you're supposed to die, and then you go to Hades, and it's terrible. Like it's a horrible existence. Achilles says, "I'd rather be a slave on a farm than be the king of Hades." It's that bad. So you start tying these things in, like this view of resurrection, this view of who God is, this view of afterlife. How do these things tie into near-death experiences and Jesus' resurrection? They start to bring all these different facets together in a really interesting, powerful way.
Really, it's like a mosaic. It starts coming
Yeah.
together, and you're like painting this picture to build this conviction in the resurrection. Did it happen? Did it not? And then ultimately, we have that decision what we do with that. So let me throw this question at you: how reliable are the resurrection accounts in the New Testament? Given that they were written maybe decades after the events, bring us into some things you've learned on that. Can we trust what we're reading in the Bible?
Yeah, so okay, it's going to be tough for me not to say it is trustworthy, because I got a book called Trustworthy: 13 Arguments for the Reliability of the New Testament. So I think the New Testament as a whole is reliable. Even if we use the late dates, and I call them late dates, for the Gospels being written from, say, 65 to 95 AD, that's still within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. And even skeptics will use those dates. And that's so on the late dates, we can use that. Now, there are skeptics who date the Gospels earlier than that. Some date the Gospel of Mark to 40 AD. It's pretty early. That's within 10 years of the events. Um, and others date, the other Gospels earlier as well. A recent book just came out that dates everything before 70 AD. So super early. But so we can appeal to those. I think that's fine. I think that's good. But what we often do is you've got the Gospels. This is a whole thing. We call it the timeline argument, or Habermas calls it the timeline argument. And so I'm stealing it from him. But the Gospels are good. Paul's writings are even earlier than the Gospel. So we mentioned 1 Corinthians 15. That's dated to, it was written in 55 AD. But Paul, in that very first section, verses 3 and following, he gives us a very early Christian creed, which dates even earlier. In fact, it goes to the early 30s AD. And so when we want to talk about appearances, in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 to 8, there's 3 group appearances and there's 3 individual appearances. So we have group appearances out of the gate. We've got individual appearances out of the gate. And now we're not talking about decades later, but we're seeing what the early Christians preached. Now, of course, too, when the gospel authors were writing, it's not as though they just took a break for, 30 years. They'd been preaching that message the whole time. You might go, well, what were they preaching? Paul tells us, like we said at the beginning, for I preach to you the gospel, which I also received, that has the power to save and is of first importance. And then, I didn't mention this, but in verse 11, he says, whether I or they, referring to the other apostles, whether whoever's preaching this, it doesn't matter, but it's that you believe the gospel. And so he's saying this is the same gospel that everyone's preaching. And I did mention it was a creed, and it goes to the early 30s. Even like this is widely accepted, that this creed in 1 Corinthians 15 goes to the early 30s. But it's also connected with 2 really key people. And if there were 2 people you'd want to meet in the early church, I'm sure Peter would be one. And then James is the other. James was the leader of the early church in Jerusalem. And they're both mentioned in Galatians 1:18. Because Paul says just 3 years after his own conversion, he went to Jerusalem and stayed with Peter for 15 days and then with James afterwards. So A lot of scholars think that's the time when Paul got this information. He studied with them. I mean, it uses the Greek word visit. The Greek word is hysteresis, and the root word of that is histor, where we get our word history from. So he's not hanging out just, playing hockey with the guys, wrestling with them or something, but they're there for a purpose. And the entire context of First Corinthians, the beginning section there, 1 Corinthians 15, is the gospel, like we just said. But Galatians 1 and 2 is about the gospel. So we know that's the subject of discussion. And so it's just a really powerful piece of evidence that's very, very, very early.
Fascinating. And that is something that separates the Bible from a lot of other historical texts, is that is incredibly close. You don't have time for legend to take root. You still have eyewitnesses that are alive. You have people there that didn't want this to be true. They didn't want the message of the resurrection spreading. And so people would have challenged those things. And yet we see into that environment with those people still alive, these are the things being written. It really increases our ability to trust what we're reading.
Yeah, there's virtually
So
no other world view, world religion, major scriptures that has internal documents like we do, because Paul's writing letters to the churches. These are like, if someone could see our emails to one another, that's essentially what they're getting. We would love to have that, in politics, I suppose. Different story. But you get the idea, right? Like there's no propaganda being conceived of here. This is in-house discussions of believers between one another. And what are they teaching? What do they believe? Well, he's telling them. He's reminding them, hey, this is what I preached to you when I was with you guys. And so we're seeing those things, and they're so early. Paul was an eyewitness. And then on top of that, he was not just an eyewitness, he was an enemy. Then he was a preacher, and then he was persecuted and ends up dying. So I mean,
he's a fascinating story in this entire narrative as well. Amazing. But you make a great point here about 1 Corinthians 15. You mentioned the creeds. I want to hone in on that for a sec, because you do say here, what we read in 1 Corinthians 15, where it reads about how Jesus was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive. What a statement. Though some have fallen asleep, and then he appeared to James, and then to all the apostles. Last to one untimely born, he appeared to me. And you're saying that this was something that the early church shared with one another before we even have some of these writings. You called this a creed. Will you speak to that a little bit? What do you
yeah,
mean?
yeah. So there's a couple elements and angles to that. We'll just stick on creeds. That'll be the help keep me focused. There's a number of creeds in the New Testament. So when we're talking about creeds, we're not talking about the band. We're not talking about the Nicene Creed. We're not talking about any of that stuff. We're talking about oral tradition preserved in writing in the New Testament itself. And so there's a number of them. And there's good reason why they would make them up, because if the culture is largely illiterate, how can I pass on information to you without creating a formula that you can memorize easily? And so that's why pastors may often use alliteration or something like that. But the same thing applied back then. They needed to be able to pass off tradition to one another in a formalized way, which allowed them to deliver and receive the information so that it could then be passed on. And Paul uses that language of delivered and received in 1 Corinthians 15. It was actually typical Pharisaic language, and Paul, of course, was a Pharisee. So this wasn't just exclusive to Christians doing this kind of thing. Again, it's a cultural thing, right? The same way we might say we use social media or something. And the point of all this is that there's a number of creeds, and 1 Corinthians 15 is one of the most easily identifiable because Paul uses that language of, I delivered to you that which I also received. So he's saying he received this, the way this thing is structured, he received it. And he's able to pass that on. And he says that in 1 Corinthians, I believe it's 11 as well, where he talks about the Last Supper, because he's talking about that tradition that he also received. So those are two, but there's a number of other creeds, and they call them other names too, like confessional statements, kerygma, oral formulas, different formulations like that, all sorts of different names. I just use the word creeds because it's easier. But Philippians 2:5-11, a very, very powerful verse about Jesus who, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself and took on the form of a bondservant. So that's a powerful early Christian, they call that a Christian hymn. There's other indicators too, besides just the delivered and received. There's style and prose, and if in the Greek it stands out a little bit more. We don't have to worry about all that, but there's ways to identify that
But
we can get.
you make a really good point about like these creeds go way back, and this increases our confidence in the resurrection account, not only in the New Testament but just period. That we thousands of years later can believe in this event happening because we literally have testimony right to the very time of when this happened. That to the point where many of these people were still alive.
Yeah, yeah.
That's
Well, yeah.
that's
This
fascinating.
is
So
the
this
early
was being
30s.
spread while these people were alive.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's the early 30s AD. And I mean, here's some other ones. So Philippians 2, 5-11 is incredible. Romans 10:9, if you confess with your, so the word confess there is the word homologia, same word. We're giving the same. So that's something that they might say before a baptism. So this is the sort of teachings that one would say, and that's how that passing off of tradition would look like in the real world. This is something you would say before you're getting baptized. And the word homologia would typically have the idea of a public proclamation of what you're doing. And you're confessing Christ as Lord. So you're giving him your allegiance, you're giving him your faithfulness, you're giving him everything of you. And then you believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead. So these elements are deeply intertwined. And there's powerful elements to that because when you're saying Jesus is Lord, you're saying Caesar is not. That's one of the elements. But it gets deeper than that. And I love this, and it's always going to stick with me. But Romans 10:9, that's the creedal part. And then in verse 13, so just a couple verses later, Paul quotes Joel 2:32, which says, if you confess, whoever calls upon the name of the Lord will be saved. So he just said in verse 9, you have to confess Jesus as Lord and you'll be saved. And here he's quoting Joel 2:32, which says, whoever calls upon the name of the Lord will be saved. But if you look at Joel 2:32, who is that referring to, calling upon Lord to be saved? It's referring to Yahweh. So now Paul is saying, do to Jesus what we do to Yahweh. Confess him as Lord. And you're like, oh, okay, this is getting really deep and really profound here it's that mosaic that you mentioned.
That's powerful. And what an unbelievable promise that comes. If you confess him as Lord and you believe in your heart that he was raised from the grave, you will be saved. What an unbelievable blessing. And it's amazing. That's so good. Yes, this mosaic is being painted. Let me throw another question your way. Do we have any evidence of non-biblical sources, people outside of our biblical writers that would corroborate maybe with the events of the resurrection? What have you learned from that?
Yeah, yes. So the short answer is yes. Um, and we mentioned earlier about, the gospels, are they considered late? And I'm going to tie in an answer to that and an answer to this question at the same time. Um, there's one of the, perhaps the greatest Roman historian, his name's Tacitus. And he's one of the earlier sources for Tiberius. If you remember, he was the ruler when Jesus died. And he dies in 37 AD. And so he's our earliest source after Tiberius died, about Tiberius. And so that's pretty impressive. Our earliest biography. So he dies in 37. His earliest biography is in the 2nd century. So there's a bigger gap between him and Tacitus than there is between Jesus, who is he's a Jewish person who had been crucified in Jerusalem. Like, why would there be 4 biographies on him? But his biographies are all closer in time than Tiberius's is to Tacitus. So that's point one. And then Tacitus, he makes comments about Jesus because and this is true of most non-Christian sources, because if they're uninterested to write about Jesus, why would they write about Jesus? They don't care. Well, they write about him because they have to, because the Christian movement is coming alongside these secular movements, and that's causing them to write about him. So Tacitus is writing about the Christian persecution that's going on under Nero in the 60s AD. And Nero's doing horrific things to believers. And it's so bad that even non-Christians are like, Nero's got to take it easy on him because this is too much. And so he was crucifying them and then lighting them on fire so the garden would be lit at night. Like, terrible things like that. So much so, again, that the wider world was like, give them some mercy. And in that context, Tacitus describes some things about Jesus. And in this description, he tells us that Jesus was crucified under Pilate, or he suffered the extreme penalty under Pilate, but it's referring to crucifixion because Romans wouldn't say the word crucifixion unless out of necessity. Um, and that it broke out in Judea and then came back up to Rome. So it says some other things too, but those are some key points for us right now. It's important to note that he doesn't say Jesus died in a rebellion in Greece. He's testifying exactly what we find in the Gospels, that Jesus was crucified. Uh, and that's evidence for the resurrection, because you can't raise to and defeat death if you didn't have death, right? So you have to have the crucifixion to have the resurrection. And then he says too that the movement originated in Judea. It didn't start in Egypt, didn't start in India, it started in Judea. And so the fact that it was first proclaimed in Jerusalem is another important factor. So that's one, that's Tacitus. Josephus is another source, and I just want to pull him up now because there's some new evidence out by a scholar named Schmidt, and I believe you can get the book for free online. I'll email that to you, and you can put it in the link if you want. But he's come out with some new evidence. There used to be some debate over Josephus's passage, whether or not the whole thing was authentic or just parts. And for the most part, they thought, okay, maybe just these parts are authentic, because it seems too nice about Jesus for it to be the whole thing to be authentic, because Josephus wasn't a Christian. And so I'll read you guys the comment here in a second. But this new book shows that no, this whole thing is authentic, and here's a number of good reasons to think that it is. And basically, our textual evidence suggests that it is, and the comments here, all the arguments against it being authentic actually fall short. And it's published by Oxford University Press, so it's not like it's Ben's Backyard Publishing or anything like that. But here's the comment from Josephus. He says, "Now there was at this time a man, Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many Jews and Greeks. He was the Messiah. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of many principled men among us," Josephus, by the way, was part of the priestly class, the upper class, the elites. So he knew the principled men among Jerusalem, and he's from that area, by the way. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principled men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets foretold these things, and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians so named from him are not extinct to this day. And that's dated to the 1st century. So, again,
What a
pretty
statement.
powerful verse. Yeah. Pretty powerful. Not verse, but yeah.
Here's
text.
Josephus, who is not a Christian, but he's saying he was the Messiah.
Now, some people are going to say, okay, that's kind of like an atheist like Bart Ehrman saying, well, the disciples believed this, or they believe that. And you go, oh, he's still attesting to the same thing we're finding in the New Testament here. But Josephus is in the place to know a lot of these things. And Schmidt unpacks a lot of the relationships that Josephus had with the Jewish leaders who were in a position to know all those sorts of things.
That's so cool. This is so much fun.
And that was just two. We just mentioned two.
Oh man, this is so
there's
much
a
fun.
number of sources outside the New Testament that
I love geeking out on this stuff with you, man. This is great. All right, I got just a few more questions and we can wrap up. I would love to ask you this. You mentioned Ehrman. I would love to know, what are some of the strongest and most challenging arguments against the resurrection, and how do you address some of those?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one popular way is to say, I don't know. And so what you'll see is, I don't know what happened, but I know what didn't happen, the resurrection. So that's one, and it's kind of like a perpetual agnosticism where I can never know, no one can ever know. But if you say it's not the resurrection, well, then we can know some things, because in order for you to reject it, you're clearly knowing some things have happened. And so, and typically that rejection has to do with the miracles or things of that nature. Because a lot of scholars, well, in history, there's this weird, I think it's weird. There's this weird view that historians can't say a miracle has occurred. So they'll say we just don't have the tools to do it because we're not theologians or we're not philosophers. And I'm like, okay, but I don't understand why that stops you from saying that Jesus rose from the dead. You could still say that and say, I don't know exactly how God did it or if God did it, but Jesus was dead and he's now alive. And because there's elements where we do that with near death experiences where they don't know what's going on, but they're like, hey, he saw Gary's car. He thought that red car was a cool car. So Ben recognized it. I don't know how to explain it, but that's the reality. And Gary has a red car, so it's corroborated. So you could do that path. But I think you can push historians further because historians cross discipline all the time. They talk about, in the French Revolution, they're talking about politics and government and war. I've never heard a historian go, well, I'm not trained on political science, so I shouldn't write a history book on the French Revolution. Like, no, they do that stuff. Or they'll do stuff on the Great Depression. But you're not an economist. How are you doing that? So they do it already. It's just when it comes to the resurrection, this idea of miracles, it's kind of a hangover from the Enlightenment. I think that's on its way out now, though, personally. Hopefully. Maybe I'm hoping. That's a little wishful thinking on my
Interesting.
part.
So, like one way that people basically challenge the resurrection is they just kind of claim, I don't know, and I'm not
Yeah.
qualified to know.
Yeah.
And they just kind of remove themselves from any of the evidence or from even saying that they're qualified to make a decision on it. And they just kind of escape the situation. That's one way that people challenge it.
Yeah. Yeah. And the reason for there's a reason for that. I should have mentioned this. Um, the alternative theories have proven surprisingly to the skeptic's surprise, um, unsuccessful repeatedly. And in Habermas's volume 2, so he's got 3 volumes. The second volume is just responding to alternative theories. It's like 900 pages responding to alternative theories. But he's got a chapter in there that is skeptics arguing against skeptics on alternative views. So this guy may put forward the swoon theory, but this hallucination theorist goes, oh, that theory doesn't match the evidence because of A, B, and C. Then he goes, well, your hallucination theory fails because of A, B, and C over here. And so they attack themselves. And so they're right when they're on those portions where they're sticking to history, but then when they try to change history to make it fit their theory, people call them out on it. And so that's part of the reason why guys today, very few pick one theory today and try to run with it because they're very difficult to stand. Especially, and not just like, there's some widely agreed facts surrounding Jesus's resurrection. And it doesn't matter if you're an atheist, if you're an agnostic, if you're Jewish, if you're a Christian, liberal, conservative, doesn't matter. There's some widely accepted facts there. So um, those are facts that we can use to argue against those naturalistic theories, and not just us, but skeptics as well.
Well, it's interesting. As you're talking about that, I sit and I think there's a lot of different ideas that people can have maybe to try to debunk the resurrection. But one of the strongest ways that we can communicate the reality of it is really to speak to these things that are for the resurrection. So instead of trying to just, debunk what they're claiming, like, hey, we can prove to you that hallucination theory is wrong, and we're going to try to argue in that space, we can really just point people to the things we've been talking about for 40 minutes, which is here's the
Yeah.
reasons why we're painting this mosaic that it did happen. The
Yeah.
disciples did this. We have this physical evidence. We have near-death experiences. We have biblical New Testament reliability that went back basically almost to the exact dates that this happened. We have the creeds. The list goes on of all these things that add up to our trust in the resurrection. That ultimately is the answer to whatever alternative theories.
Yeah, yeah, I think so, for a bunch of reasons. One, if I wanted to learn a slap shot from you, I don't wanna learn 10 ways that people have messed up a slap shot. I want you to show me what's the ways I need to do it, what's the positive ways to do it. That's one. 2, when I wa I was a marketing undergrad who hated school, Liberty was my 5th college, so, like, when I was reading about this stuff, I just had my own questions, and I started reading this case for the resurrection, and that's what I got. What are those positive elements? This is what Habermas is known for, creating what's called the minimal facts approach. The minimal facts approach uses only data that's highly evidenced and highly evidenced historically, like using critical historical methods, and then is also widely accepted by scholars from virtually all different backgrounds. So widely accepted and highly evidenced. Excuse me. And you get some key key data points, like you're talking key positive events that we have to explain. Some of them include Jesus' death on the cross. You mentioned the early creeds, that early proclamation of the resurrection that's, again, widely accepted, and the early dating of it, its connection to the eyewitnesses, that the disciples had experiences of the risen Jesus, that they were willing to suffer and die, the conversion of Paul, the conversion of James. Like, those are just 7 facts you could do in a elevator pitch, but also they're things you can remind yourself, like you said at the very beginning, when you're struggling with something or you're in some challenge, you have all those facts. And one of the things I like to do to also help people is we'll go out and speak a lot of times and at churches and whatever. And I like to present the facts, but then I present these alternative theories and say, okay, you guys now use these facts and apply them. We're not just there for us to memorize. That doesn't do anything. We want to be able to apply them to these alternative theories. So, because where our mind goes, our feet follow. And we want to be able to stand firm in the resurrection, live in the reality of the resurrection. So that way, when we hear those questions, we can answer them. We can encourage other believers. And then when we see the good works that God's prepared beforehand for us to walk in, we can do that too.
Come on. So good. I love it, man. It fires me up. This is great, great stuff. All right, I got one last question for you, and then we're going to kind of close it out. But when you're doing all your research, all these years, you wrote the book over 1,000 pages, you have 7,000 footnotes, you've been digging on all sorts of different fronts with the resurrection. What is something that has just brought you the most joy in discovering and has strengthened your faith in Christ?
It's those minimal facts in combination with 1 Corinthians 15:58, probably those two. Um, because they have just encouraged me. And again, I remember still, I was turning right as I was thinking, the reality of the resurrection is something I can't escape. And then the question that follows that, so the resurrection happened, and those are the facts for it. And then the question after that, so what? What are you going to do now? What follows?
Come on. That's so encouraging. And I think about that really applies to those that don't believe in Jesus. What do? Well, we do the very thing in Romans 10. We confess him as Lord. We believe in our heart that he was raised from the dead, and scripture says you will be saved. So we can come to Christ in faith. But for the Christian, when we think about the resurrection, what am I going to do about it? What I think of personally is in the face of doubt, the resurrection is a weapon for me to win in that moment. Did the resurrection happen? Yeah, I might not know all the details of this New Testament argument, or I don't fully understand how this thing goes together. Did the resurrection happen? Yes. And from that starting spot, it strengthens me to then attack the questions I have maybe about the Bible or about life or about circumstances or whatever it might be. And we can always come back to this grounding. Did Jesus rise from the grave? So as a Christian, it strengthens me to live a confident, victorious life.
That's exactly right. We have one of the webinars we have, Ron Davis is the founder of CORE, and he did his dissertation on dealing with doubt. And that's one of the key points, that if you understand the resurrection happened, you can address all these other questions comfortably. You're not stressed or anxious about, oh, well, what if this or what if that? Like, well, the resurrection happened. So I've got the gospel. I've got that. So let me explore some of these other questions now. And some people, that takes a long time. Dr. Habermas mentored Mike Licona, and that was Licona actually just published this discussion they had back in the 80s about where Licona was wrestling with this issue and this issue and this issue. And Habermas kept going, but Mike, did Jesus rise from the dead? Yeah, he did. Okay, that's a good point. But what about this? Did Jesus rise from the dead? Yeah, okay, all right, yeah, he did. Okay. So he was able to keep coming back to that grounding point, which is so important because our emotions change, our circumstances change, but the resurrection is there. It's our anchor point. It's one of our foundational points. It's of first importance for us.
Come on. I love how you use that word anchor. And that really is what we began to talk about at the very beginning, was conviction in the resurrection. You say the word anchor. It's an anchor for us as followers of Jesus. It's also a source of strength for us to live a victorious life. It's such a powerful thing. I love it, man. I love geeking out in this. There's more to learn, but it's so amazing when this mosaic is painted that all of this comes together to really strengthen us that, yes, this happened.
Yeah,
Jesus really
you know what's good
died.
too? You identified it's because when people hear apologetics or historical facts of the resurrection, they're thinking, "Oh, I don't wanna argue," or, "That's too academic for me." Like, no, this is part of good discipleship. And I think you made that comment earlier. This is when I went to Liberty, when I was learning, like, I was a believer, but I wasn't discipled. Like, I had a lot of questions. And if as a follower of Jesus, like, you wanna know more about him, and you're gonna have questions, so you need people who can help you. So learning these things encourages you as a disciple. That's like what you've just been saying. It's so true. And then it's also for evangelism because you can share with people, like, the gospel is about Jesus is it's of first importance. Jesus' resurrection, so you can go right back to that over and over again.
So encouraging. I remember when I first came to Christ, I was as green as they came. I never knew nothing about the Bible. I came to know the Lord. I encountered Jesus. I believed in the gospel that he had died and he arose from the grave. I experienced an overwhelming joy coming to know Christ, but I knew nothing of the Bible. And I had so many questions. And I had this religion class that I was in because I was like, hey, I'm going to do this class. I'm interested in this stuff now. And my guy that was in there was a skeptic. He was not a Christian leading a religion class. He was a very intentional skeptic that was teaching on the subject, but it was very academic. And it challenged me on these different fronts. And I'll never forget sitting there thinking, just because I don't know the answer today doesn't mean the answer's not there.
Mm.
Did Jesus rise from the dead? Did this happen? Yeah, I believe it did. And that was like the starting spot for me as this new believer to
Yeah.
to face up to all this disconnect with education. Like I just hadn't learned the things that I've maybe learned today, and I still have more to learn, way more. But it's like that is such a seed of strength for us. So good.
Man, that's awesome. I didn't know that story about you. That's awesome. That's a that will get you into it, because 'cause you're getting tested right out of the gate. But
Right out of the gate.
that's the important thing. As believers, start right away. Like, you're engaging it right away.
And little by little, little by little, so if anybody's listening and they've never read the Bible, great stuff. Just start chewing away little by little,
Look,
little by
when I
little.
went to Liberty, I didn't know Paul wrote half the New Testament, like, so I didn't know and when I said I went there and I didn't like school.
And now you're this rockin' theologian writing books like crazy. Yeah, I love it. All right, well, to close it up, we're done today. Will you tell us a little bit about Core Apologetics? How can people get connected to you? Give us a little insight to what you're doing. We want to funnel people your way because your ministry is amazing. And just tell us a little bit about that and how people can get connected.
Yeah, thanks, appreciate that. We so I just mentioned I had to go to Liberty, and I've part of what I felt like after attending Liberty was I had to go to graduate school to get discipled. And I was like, "Oh, this doesn't feel right. It shouldn't be this way. We should be getting discipled at churches and small groups and things like that." And my friend Ron, who I mentioned, I was on his dissertation committee when he was on doing this emotional doubt dissertation. He goes, "Ben, I got a crazy idea. Come partner with me at Core," because it was just a doubters ministry at that time. "We'll relaunch it, and now we're using apologetics to help build disciples, equip disciples, and minister to those with doubts and questions." And so we do that in a number of different ways. We do events where we'll come speak. We're working on a curriculum right now for the next generation called Ask Me, because 52% of Gen Z right now are motivated to learn about Jesus, and another Gen Z is their most likely as their most trusted source for information about Jesus. So not a pastor, not an adult. So then the question is, how well equipped are they? Well, we better equip them because they need to be. So that's one of the other things we're doing. We do live webinars is another thing we do. I took classes online in college. Discussion boards aren't great. They're not great. And so we do live webinars because we want to be able to do this where you can actually ask a question. And from a teaching perspective, like I want to teach, not just go through modules. I enjoy this part. And so I think that's one of the other ways where we can help. And we've had high school students to heart surgeons in these courses and just getting equipped because if, to use this analogy, doesn't matter if you're a white belt or a black belt, like we need to learn these foundational core truths to go be effective disciples in all disciplines. And
I
so that's
love it.
what we're trying to do.
It's an amazing ministry you have, especially in our day where there is so much information being spread all across YouTube and Instagram and all these different social media platforms. Like we're speaking into that, the truth of things that are reliable, and we're equipping people to be able to use that information for the gospel. It's a great ministry you have. So you come alongside pastors and you help them with their churches. you come in and speak at different events that are necessary. You also will run online workshops and webinars. You have books that you're creating and curriculum. Everybody can find this stuff at your website, which is great. And your ministry is extraordinary, man. I love it. It's amazing. For us, we are actually going to partner with you. And so this is anybody listening. If you want to join us here in September, we're going to do a 6-week workshop with Ben, and we're going to let him dive deep on some of this stuff with the resurrection. I'm so pumped. You can find all the information in the link below. If you want to sign up for that, we'd love to have you. You can check out all those details. It'll be on Monday nights at 7:00. We'd love to have anybody interested. Join us. It'll be online. And then on top of that, I want to say also, you have a book called Trustworthy, 13 Reasons Why the New Testament is Reliable. This is another way that people can connect with you specifically and support all that you're doing. I'll put that link as well in below if anybody wants to pick that up. But that's just a great book on can you trust the New Testament? And would you say that anybody could read that? That's not necessarily a scholarly level. Like I'm an academic. I can
It is
read that as a
not,
lay
yeah.
guy.
It is not a 1,000-page book. It's about 150 pages, maybe 10 chapters or 10 pages a chapter, but it's meant, again, as a jujitsu black belt, when you teach, sometimes you got white belts in the class, sometimes you got black belts. This is one of those ones that seeks to hit everybody on a number of different arguments, but now you're introduced to them and you're gonna be like, oh, that's really cool. I didn't know about this, or I didn't know about that. So yeah, it's a great introduction to the different arguments for New Testament reliability.
So good. I love it. All right. Well, thank you, Ben. We're so blessed by you, man, and excited to have you back in the future. And can't wait for the thing coming up here in September. So
Yeah.
sounds good. Friends, thank you so much. I'll just say this as we close for joining. Thank you, friends, for joining the Pure Encouragement Podcast. What a blessing. Our mission is to strengthen and encourage people to live a confident, victorious life in Christ. Again, friends, I'm Gary Steffes. It's such an honor to be able to join you. Thanks so much for joining today, Ben.
Thanks for having me. Looking forward to coming up in the fall.